Hey guys, how you doing? I'm going to go through the 1920s, Great Depression, and New Deal. This is sort of like a consolidated version of all the notes that I posted a little while back when the whole first pandemic started. Um, you know that your test was assigned and it's due on Tuesday. I already know some of you have already gotten it in. I've already posted this presentation on Google Classroom. So again, this is just for people who want some explanation, maybe that will help you understand things a little bit better. And it's always good to hold on to this for when we have a final, whatever that final is going to look like. I'm really not sure at this point, but let me go through it. I'll try to make it quicker than the last one, but we'll see if that happens. We just got done, with the last presentation talking about World War One, and after World War One, there's sort of a shift in mentality in America. There's a shift of that whole progressive movement that occurred before we got involved in World War One. It's going to go to really focusing on the United States of America and focusing on what to do here. Also, you're going to start to see the end of American involvement in the economy, whereas the progressive era started to fight to end corporations and things like that. That's going to take a back seat. That's going to lead to a administration known as the Harding administration, Warren G. Harding administration. He wins the presidency in this time period with his slogan, "The Return to Normalcy." He's a Republican, and he has a very pro-business approach. Progressivism, like we talked about, does continue, but it definitely slows down. He's really not going to be known as a great president. He actually dies in office about 2 years after he takes over. He had a lot of theft, fraud, and other scandals that went on during his administration. One of the biggest ones was the T-Bot Dome scandal. I'm not going to really go over that too much because really, for this year's purposes, we don't really need to focus on that. The person I'm going to really focus on a little bit more is Calvin Coolidge. He is going to take over for when Warren G. Harding passes away. And the interesting thing about him is that he has to take over, and he's not even in Washington, D.C. when the president dies. So there's like a little bit of a lapse looking for Calvin Coolidge, trying to get in contact with him. He's actually in Vermont. And in order to get sworn in as president, you need to find a federal judge. So a few hours passed until they found Calvin Coolidge, a federal judge, to swear in Vermont, and he was sworn in by candlelight in a farmhouse in Vermont. So that's a story about him. There's Calvin Coolidge over there, this guy right here. That's him on the left, and this is Warren G. Harding on the right. And this was their campaign slogan when they ran for president back in when Harding ran for president back in 1921. And there's Calvin Coolidge being sworn in by the candlelight. Calvin Coolidge is really going to be that president that is overseeing what is known as the Roaring Twenties. We'll talk more about what that actually means down the road in a couple of slides. But the biggest thing is the economy, more particularly the stock market. The one thing we need to realize that is that if the stock market's doing well, it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody's doing well. And we can, this would be a topic we talk more about in class, but I'm not going to go on and on about that. Nevertheless, it's from 1923 to 1929. It's a big booming business period. Uh, we're going to talk about how this gets involved with the Great Depression in a few slides, so I'll save it for then. The standard of living increases. That means just the everyday things that people expect. That would be our material possessions, the way we live, the things we buy. That rose during the 1920s. Purchasing power increases because people are buying on credit, installment buying. Many of us do that today for cars and homes and other big ticket purchases. And this word right here, laissez-faire, that's something that we've learned before, from 10th grade, and we've talked about it when we talked about the capitalists and the big business era. We sort of go back to that. The lower the taxes for the wealthy, the government reduced national debt, they balance the budget. That's all good things. However, we raise tariffs on imported goods, which means we are trying to force Americans to buy American products. That's going to hurt the world economy down the road, but during this time period, it's actually, does well for America. The biggest word that you probably need to remember for the 1920s economy is consumerism, and that's us. We're the consumer. We're the people who buy the products, and that's what's really hurting the economy now with this pandemic. Nobody's really buying stuff. The unemployment rate's high. People are, living in fear of when, they're going to get to go back to work. Uh, However, during the 1920s, people speculated. When you speculate, you're sort of guessing or you're assuming. And people were optimistic. They thought that, the stock market was always going to go up. So instead of investing, putting some of their money in a bank, they put most of their money in the stock market. And for a little while, the money kept rolling in, but it's going to come back and bite some people in the butt when the Great Depression hits. Also, mass consumption. People are buying a lot of manufactured goods. I'm not talking about people going to the grocery store and buying tons of, toilet paper and paper towels. It's, different kinds of manufactured goods during this time. Many people have more money to spend, and when you spend more money, you get more things. You get more stuff. Automobiles, electricity, motion pictures. That's going to affect American lifestyle. We'll talk about the culture of the 1920s in a slide or two. Technology as well. Technology is going to make people um, innovate more. We love technology. We're probably feeling the effects of the COVID virus with our shipping and delivery. So a lot of our stuff from Amazon's taking a week, maybe longer now, where it used to come in a day. We talked about this in class a lot, and now we're sort of feeling how it used to be, quote unquote, back in the day. Um, with our deliveries becoming a lot, less frequent than they used to be. Mass production, though, does lead to lower costs. The assembly line, of course, when we talked about Henry Ford, that's going to help products be made faster, which means they can produce more, which means you can charge less. Also, like I mentioned before, installment buying. That's when you take an overall price of something and you cut it into segments and you pay it off month by month. You're going to do that probably with your student loans. Um, Again, something we'd probably talk about more when we were in class, but I want to go quicker. That's the Model T Ford. I know we talked about Ford when we talked about the big business guys, but he came after them. He came more in the like 1900s, where like the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and all those guys came in the late 1800s. So Ford's going to be somebody that comes a little bit after all those guys. Culture, the term that roaring really refers to the cultural changes. Yeah, it also refers to the economic changes of the decade, but it's really the change in culture and how people live. People start questioning the old ways and start coming up with new ways. Cultural homogenization, that's something we're all used to today. It's something that people listen to the same music, you're watching the same films, you're reading the same books, you're seeing the same shows. Like it's like, for instance, if you're watching, Tiger King on Netflix, and everyone starts talking about Tiger King, people are doing the same things and talking about the same things. Also, the growth of suburbs, because you have the automobile, you have people who are living in outside the city radius and then go into the city for work. I think about 25 to 30% of people who work in Manhattan actually live outside of Manhattan today. So it shows you that you don't need to live in a city to work in a city, and the car is really one of the biggest things that contributes to that. This is going to grow on a grander scale after World War II, which we'll be talking about next week. Also, like I spoke about before, cultural values. It's going to be basically science first religion, out with the old, in with the new. Going, even though there is no set religion in the United States, the Protestant religion sort of dominated, and people just sort of were guided by that. Yes, of course, you can practice other religions, but religion and politics are supposed to be separate, and sometimes they got intertwined. And we'll talk more about the Scopes trial. Actually, I'll talk about the Scopes trial now. That was essentially just a Darwinism. This John Scopes was a teacher in Tennessee. He taught the theory of evolution in one of his biology classes. It was against the law to do so. He said, forget that, I'm going to teach it. It's a theory. I'm not teaching it as real, ironclad facts. I'm letting these kids make up their mind about this theory. And he got sued and he got fined. I think it was a $200 fine. He was found guilty, but it was the weak defense against why can't we teach this that led to it being thrust onto the nation scene of this whole religion versus science debate. So that's John Scopes. Wealth, possessions, having fun, sexual freedom, These were all sort of things that people started to begin to value during this time. There's John Scopes um, to the right, with the cool glasses, and that's his attorney right there with his hand up in the air, very emphatically trying to get his message across. His name is Clarence Darrow. That's his attorney's name. You don't need to know that. Also, different things coming around during this time is movies, sports figures. You have Babe Ruth, you have Charlie Chaplin, who was a very famous, probably the first movie star of silent films. A lot of literature during this time period protested some of these things that were going on with the new cultural shifts. Ernest Hemingway was a big opponent to how the nation was, where the nation was headed, and the, I guess, the infatuation with materialistic things. He was, obviously a great American writer, but battled a lot of personal, had a lot of internal struggles. He ended up taking his own life um, down the road. Women, a lot of a very popular Halloween costume is dressing up as a flapper, which was during this time a young, pretty woman with bobbed hair and raised hemlines. They drank, they smoked, they thought for themselves, for crying out loud, and they took advantage of new freedoms. This was actually like 10% of the population. A lot of women didn't adapt this flapper lifestyle, but it definitely was thrust into the main eye of the American cultural shift during this time. You're also going to see a big thing here. The women get the right to vote. That's about 100 years ago, and that's the 19th Amendment. Just a little side fact for you: New York granted women the right to vote in 1917, but as a nation, we granted women the right to vote in 1920. There's Charlie Chaplin. There's Babe Ruth, the Sultan of Swat. There's some flappers. Ernest Hemingway. That's F. Scott Fitzgerald. He obviously wrote The Great Gatsby, which many of you probably have read in English. Also, African Americans will start showing their worth. Start showing to the country and to our society that the stereotypes against them were unnecessary. That they had a lot to contribute culturally, and that's going to be known as the Harlem Renaissance, and that's going to really be a big movement with the arts. You're going to have the literary writings of Langston Hughes. You're going to have the great musical abilities of Duke Ellington. You're going to have the great cultural movement by educated African Americans of W.E.B. Du Bois, and Langston Hughes. We talked about this before when we talked about immigration, but just remember, during the 1920s, we go back to an anti-immigrant approach. This is going to be, remember, nativism. That's when you feel that new immigrants coming over have nothing positive to contribute. This is in part due to the Red Scare. The Red Scare was a fear of communism in the United States. Everything that sort of happens here is going to be magnified after World War II. A example of how bad the Red Scare was during this time was the Palmer raids. That's when A. Mitchell Palmer goes along and tries to deport people, communists, accusing them of basically trying to scheme against the United States. Another example of a big anti-immigrant movement was Sacco and Vanzetti from Massachusetts. These were two Italian immigrants. They were anarchists. They were against the government, but they became a symbol of the anti-immigrant movement. They were eventually sentenced to death. Their innocence to this day is debated, but 50 years after their case, they were granted innocence by the mayor of the governor, I believe, of Massachusetts. It's the way the case was handled that really showed that it was an anti-immigrant movement. The way the evidence was handled wasn't handled well. There was a lot of loopholes. They wanted to be made an example out of, and Sacco and Vanzetti were eventually sentenced to death. You also see an unfortunate rise of the KKK again in the South, which when we talked about the Reconstruction period, we talked about that. That's W.E.B. Du Bois. There's Langston Hughes. There's Duke Ellington rocking that sweet top hat. This is, again, you've seen this in class, but this shows you the anti-immigrant movement. You see here the various acts of the 1920s, the Quota Act of 1921, the Quota Act of 1924, and they're specifically targeting the South and Eastern Europe. That's your Italians and people like that. You see here the influx of people from 1907 to 1914, and then how it just dwindles down to almost nothing by 1924. There's Sacco and Vanzetti. Also, one of the unpopular, infamous amendments of all time was the only amendment ever to be taken away by another amendment. Is the Prohibition era. This is going to lead to definitely going to lead to organized crime. You're going to see your Al Capone and people like that rise to prominence. It's going to really do more harm than good. People who want alcohol will eventually get it by buying it illegally. People producing it illegally are known as bootleggers. You're going to have your speakeasies, which is a very popular theme for bars and restaurants today. But the prohibition at one point, the 18th Amendment in 1919, gets rid of all sale and manufacturing and consumption of alcohol. They bring it back in 1933 with the 21st Amendment, and the real big reason why they brought it back, well, two big reasons, is that they wanted to tax it, and that could make money for the government because we were in the Great Depression, and it was a law that they knew nobody was following. So, it shows you unpopular laws will be hard to enforce. So if the country passes a law that's really not going to be enforced, there is a chance that it could be overturned. The 1920s will give way to the Great Depression, and it's all going to come crashing down. All the boom of the economy in the 1920s, there was a lot of underlying issues with that. Like I said before, just because the stock market was doing well didn't mean that everyone was doing well. Farmers weren't prospering, African Americans weren't prospering as much, Native Americans weren't prospering as much. People had a false sense of security. People were buying their stocks on margin, which is this word right here, which means they actually weren't even paying for their stocks. They were paying for a fraction of it, and they were hoping that the stock would make enough money to pay itself off. But no one really thought about, well, what if the stock doesn't make money? You still owe money. It all come crashing down on what they call Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. Stocks lost a value of $14 billion. We're talking about 1929 money, $14 billion. It almost totally wiped out the stock market. Unemployment rate will soar to about 25% during this time. What caused it? Overproduction. We just keep making things that nobody eventually is going to buy, and then it just sits in a warehouse and nobody buys it. And then when you don't need to make it anymore, people lose jobs. Overexpansion of credit. This happens sometimes in our nation's history. It happened a few times after the Great Depression. But you give people credit. You give people mortgages for houses they can't afford, or you give people loans for stocks that they can't eventually pay off. Banks want to lend because banks make interest, and banks just going to lend. Fragile corporate structures. The government, that laissez-faire economy, did not help with the problems that are going to lead to the Great Depression. You have farmers, like I said before, that are not making much money. You have underconsumption, which means people aren't buying. But the big thing is, still to this day, you have this issue: unequal distribution of wealth. 1% of the total population owned about 60% of everything. 1%. So, yeah, I mean, that just speaks for itself. This is a little bit of a closer look at the stock market crash. You don't really need to know what these numbers mean. Just know that this was the high and this was the one-day low. And then you see how it just continues to trickle down. These numbers today are more like 25, 26, 27,000. This is the Dow Jones. And again, this is not these numbers don't mean monetary value. They just are like a sort of like a gauge. It's like a rating scale, if you will. This is a zoomed out view of since 1900, a little bit before. It looks about 1890 of the stock market. Okay, and you see how it's eventually gone all the way up. This is today. This is before the whole COVID situation. But you look at the Great Depression. I mean, look at these numbers. This is 10 to 100, and then we start going by the thousands. This is a monumental collapse. You do see the history of the stock market here. There's always ups and downs, right? There's always ups and downs. We always recover. These little dips right here, these are called recessions. Okay, this happened, and we're probably definitely, most likely gonna go into one or already in one because of COVID. But you always bounce back. All right. You always bounce back. Herbert Hoover is going to be the president that takes over after Calvin Coolidge in the 1920s. And when everything hits the fan, he doesn't do enough. He tries, but he doesn't do enough. He believes that in rugged individualism. He thinks the economy is going to fix itself. He does try to provide some help to some companies so they avoid bankruptcy and things like that, but he doesn't do enough. He doesn't help the American people directly. We see with COVID and the pandemic, um, unemployment benefits. Small businesses are getting loans. They're probably going to help out the states so education doesn't get hit, and hospitals and police departments and fire departments don't have to lay off people. Our government, as much as it's divided, definitely responded quickly with getting people money that they needed because they lost their jobs. I think 24 million people have now filed for unemployment since the pandemic started. So you can really draw an example to what Herbert Hoover didn't do and what we did in response to the pandemic. He did not provide relief. The thing that's going to really hurt Herbert Hoover is his reaction to World War I veterans. It's going to be known as the Bonus Army. World War I veterans tried to get their bonuses early. They were owed a bonus from their, duty in World War I. They marched to Capitol Hill, to Congress, and they demanded their bonuses early because they were being hurt by the Great Depression. Congress says no. Herbert Hoover sends in the army to break it up, and the rest is going to be history. People view that as kind of barbaric. How can the president of the United States actually send the army against these veterans? But there was no violence, but they basically forced them to leave. It's Herbert Hoover. Those are the bonus army. They actually set up camp outside of the Capitol building and camped out there. What did the Great Depression look like? Well, it wasn't good. 25% unemployment. That's 12 million people at that time. People lost their life savings because they they had a bunch of faith in the stock market, and instead of investing in saving some of their money for the banks, which eventually are going to fail anyway, people lost all their life savings waiting on bread lines. African American unemployment skyrockets. Women weren't really as affected as much because they had jobs that men didn't really want back then. Not saying it, in a negative context. That was just the case. Families moved in together. Marriages were postponed. Birth rates dropped. People weren't having families. People didn't go to college. Things like that. People living in poverty, their little makeshift towns were known as Hoovervilles. We'll take a picture. We'll take a look at a picture of that. This is the 1929 unemployment rate. You see the very next year it skyrockets and it hits 25%. This is going to be right around when FDR is elected. So we'll talk about FDR in a second. Those are Hoovervilles. Breadline. Also mixed in during this time period, the 1930s really weren't fun. No one's going to go back into a time machine and say, let me go back to the 1930s because that looks like a great time. It really is probably a decade that we want to skip in American history. Farmers suffer a severe income drop because of people were unable to buy food. Droughts and poor farming methods led to giant dust storms that swept across the Great Plains. I mean, these massive static electricity dust storms that could be seen all the way from New York City. That just, you'll see pictures in a second. It was crazy. About a third of the people who live in the Midwest end up leaving. Really seemed like to be the end of the world for the people who live there. Poor little guy. Needless to say, Herbert Hoover is not going to win re-election because of his lack of involvement with the Great Depression, and that's going to bring in FDR, who's a really unique guy. He's sort of a new wave of president. He's going to be something that the nation really needed at the time. He does go down as one of the nation's best presidents because of how he handled this. And you can argue that his New Deal, which we'll talk about in the next few slides, it didn't necessarily end unemployment, but what it did was provide hope for the American people. And when people have hope, they're going to be less impacted. They're going to be more positively impacting the people around them, and that's going to help things get better. Because if you're negative, people will be negative around you. But if you're positive, people tend to be positive around you. He's actually the only president to win more than 2 terms. He breaks George Washington's 2 term limit. It was nowhere written, it was the unwritten Constitution. And this guy dealt with the Great Depression and then he dealt with World War II. So, of course, when the Great Depression goes into World War II, he's like, listen, if the people don't want to elect me, they'll tell me, they'll go to the voting booths and they'll kick me out. But the fact of the matter is, nobody wanted change. Nobody wanted to be in the biggest war the world has ever seen and vote for somebody new. So FDR does win 4 elections. He dies at the beginning of the fourth one, and we'll talk about that when we talk about World War II. But he was positive. He was positive. He was optimistic. He was charismatic. He used technology. He used the radio to have these fireside chats, which was one of the assignments you were supposed to do. Most of you, I think a lot of you still owe it. He had his wife, Eleanor, who was known as his eyes and ears. They were, she was very politically active. Some first ladies just sort of take a back seat. She's sort of like a Michelle Obama who, was very politically active. Melania Trump is not so politically active. It's really up to the first lady on how she wants to be. Eleanor sort of had to be because, for those of you who do not know, FDR was in a wheelchair. He was stricken with polio in his younger years, which later left him basically paralyzed from the waist down. So she did a lot of the traveling to get his message across about the New Deal. He was controversial in the sense that FDR was experimental. He just tried things. He's like, no one's ever did it before. Let me try. If they don't like it, they don't like it. If the Supreme Court wants to take up my cases, they can take it up and they can reject a lot of my ideas. And they do. They do. And that's called checks and balances. FDR. Very rare that you found photos of him in a wheelchair while he was president, but there he is. It's him giving a fireside chat. You may notice some of the companies still around today. NBC, CBS, ABC, some of the major broadcast networks started out in radio. There's Eleanor. This is the big thing. You guys can pause this and look at a lot of these acts. You guys did a lot of this work already with the packet. That's why I'm trying to go through this quick, even though it's approaching a half hour again. But when you think about the New Deal, think about the 3 R's: relief, recovery, reform. And what does it mean? Relief for the American people, recovery for the economy, reform to avoid future depressions. I have these here with the arrows because that is what's going to be on your test, those acts specifically. Just know they all fall into the same thing. They try to either help people find a job, help people earn money, or help people have faith in the economy. I'm not going to talk about each one of these individual acts because they all fall underneath that. And again, it just anytime you see this, just think putting people back to work, helping the economy, helping people's faith in the economy, and preventing this. You don't want this to happen again. You do not want it to have to, have this happen again, and we haven't. We'll see what happens now with this situation we're in because of the coronavirus, but we hope that it will never get this bad again. He was a crafty fellow, FDR. A lot of his New Deal policies were rejected because a lot of people felt that he overstepped his boundary. So what did he try to do? He tried to add more people to the Supreme Court. He tried to raise the number from 9 to 15. He also tried to incorporate a retirement age at 70 years old. It was known as the Judicial Reorganization Bill, but it was rejected. It was a threat to separation of powers. People could argue today that the Supreme Court is in need of revamping. You have some people who there serve for life. They may serve until they're 90, 95 years old. And some new candidates for president sometimes think about having a retirement age or having a term where you only serve for 10 years and then somebody else new comes along. That's up for you to decide. The 2 major court cases of the time period were Schechter Poultry versus the United States and the U.S. versus Butler. To simplify it and make it easy for you, it just struck down New Deal policies. A lot of the New Deal policies, a lot of them were the government getting heavily involved in the economy or business or interstate trade and things like that, or expanding the power of the president. So it does show you that checks and balances did work. Some of these plans were rejected, but FDR kept plugging away and plugging away, and some of them were passed, and some of them did have an effect in a positive way. This is just a political cartoon poking fun at FDR for his court packing plan. You can read that on your own if you want and pause it. Basically implying that he's, being crafty, also showing that the Supreme Court is old at the time and feeling threatened because FDR is trying to appoint 6 new people to basically, you know, vote for the way he wants to vote. Remember, the president has the power to appoint Supreme Court justices. So naturally, if that plan was passed, he would have appointed people who agreed with him. And this shows you right here the unemployment rates during the New Deal. You see here, this is when the stock market crash begins. As unemployment rate skyrockets. You see here, this is when the New Deal comes along. A lot of the New Deal was rejected, right? But it does start coming down. Okay, it does start coming down. But the real thing that takes care of the unemployment rate is World War II. You see we're hovering right here around 15%. And then by the end of the war, look at that, we're hovering near zero or about 5%, which is healthy. When you see the unemployment rate under 5%, it's going to be known as a healthy economy and people are back to work. And that's basically it. I tried to make it brief, and of course they didn't. But nonetheless, hopefully you find this beneficial and useful. And that's basically it. Hopefully I'll see you guys sometime this century. And I'll talk to you soon. There's going to be some changes coming up to the class. By now you've heard there's going to be some sort of live component. Don't worry, I'm going to make it very painless on you. And of course, it's not going to be mandatory. And I'll talk more about that in the Google Classroom stream. I'll type it all out for you so it's easy to understand. All right. Hope you guys are well. Miss you. Bye.